Okay, so then our last shot at the somatic nervous system is on motor control. And so we've spent a lot of time talking about somatic pathways to areas in the cerebral cortex that are sensory. There are auditory areas in the temporal lobe. There are taste areas in the temporal lobe. There's olfactory areas that are um, in the frontal lobe. There's visual areas that are in uh, the occipital lobe, but we haven't talked about motor areas, and these are huge areas, and they're mostly in the frontal lobe, entirely in the frontal lobe, really. The motor areas include the frontal eye fields that control eye movement, the premotor area or motor planning area, that where lots of impulses begin. Broca's area, which is on the left side in the left cerebral hemisphere, which control the muscles of the larynx and the pharynx that are involved in producing speech. And then there's the primary motor cortex, which is the last gyrus or last fold of the frontal lobe. The other part of the frontal lobe is referred to as the prefrontal areas, and these are not formally involved in muscle or motor control. They're more often referred to as being involved in executive functions. This includes things like working memory, conscious thoughts, and planning and judgment and concentration and impulse control. This prefrontal area is where your personality sits. But it's not totally removed from motor control. There's really good evidence that physical exercise improves these executive functions. And so they're not completely unrelated. The frontal lobe is primarily for motor control. The premotor and prefrontal areas are kind of staging areas where we plan motor activities. And then the primary motor cortex involves controlling specific muscles. And these muscles, again, just like the sensory homunculus, you can make a motor homunculus that maps out what muscles are controlled where on this uh, precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. And so you can get that right there. You can do those same things. And so that homunculus looks very similar. Lots for the face and hand, lots for the pharynx involved in swallowing. Okay. Motor control also, though, is fairly complex in that instead of going directly to the muscles, there's multiple pathways that descend from the frontal lobes and go to the motors. And these pathways involve usually two neurons, an upper neuron and a lower neuron, which will be in the brain stem nuclei or in the spinal cord before there. So there's a synapse there, but there are multiple pathways. Some of these pathways are direct, the corticolobar and corticospinal pathways that go through the pyramids. These are direct pathways that go from these upper neurons of the cerebral cortex. But then there are these indirect pathways that are referred to as the extrapyramidal pathways because they avoid the pyramids of the pons. And these include the vestibulospinal, rubrospinal, and reticulospinal. And these pathways, uh, many of them pass through the thalamus, the corpus striatum, which is part of the basal ganglia. They are synapses in the substantia nigra and the red nucleus, which are important structures that are kind of buried down in the brain. And then there's lots of information in these indirect pathways that's going to the cerebellum. Okay, and so lots of this stuff goes to the cerebellum and is lots of information, sensory information, is going to the cerebellum from the position of the muscles. And so, although the motor planning and motor control occurs in the cerebrum, there's lots of stuff going on in other places. And any disruption into these indirect pathways can have lots of problems. And in fact, motor learning, while it occurs first in the cerebrum, so like when you're learning to do a difficult motor task, like learning to ride a bike, learning to play a musical instrument, driving a stick shift car. These are very difficult and require lots of conscious control and conscious movement of muscles. Later on, when those things are learned, they can be done almost subconsciously, and that's because that learning occurs in the cerebellum. And so those fine motor activities and patterns of motor activities occur there. Other types of motor control are so complex that it's really hard to explain them. A good example of that is speech and language. This is located in the left frontal cerebral cortex in most people, but it doesn't involve just the frontal lobe. There's an area of the temporal and parietal lobes called the Wernicke's area that's necessary for comprehension of speech and to formulate speech. And then Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, which is actually the motor speech area. And that Broca's area will send impulses to premotor and motor areas, which actually will cause the movements required for speech. And so when you look at these things in real time, often motor activity often involves multiple brain regions acting together in quick succession. And so here we see some scans of the brain activity showing people looking at words, listening to words, speaking, and generating words. And so these things can involve multiple brain areas. Another good example of the complexity of motor control is Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is a disease where there's a decrease in the number of neurons in the substantia nigra that secrete dopamine. This disrupts indirect pathways and makes it difficult to initiate voluntary movement. It leaves people with stiffness and tremors, and unable to get things going, even though the upper part of the brain is fine, cerebellum is fine. It's this pathway, this communication between these areas that's disrupted. So, in summary, control of voluntary movement begins in the premotor areas of the frontal lobe. The primary motor cortex controls specific muscles. Previously learned patterns of complex motor activity are stored in the cerebellum. Speech is one of these complex motor activities. There are direct and indirect motor pathways from the brain to the muscles. Personality, working memory, and other executive functions are located in the prefrontal area. Okay.